She survived the past, but can she believe in love again? Grace was once a woman with dreams, laughter, and light in her eyes until life dimmed all of it. Trapped in a cycle of emotional pain and abuse, she fought silently for years, her only anchor being her son, Elijah. When she finally walks away from the wreckage of her old life, she's determined never to look back. But healing isn't easy. Then comes Malik, gentle, patient, and everything she thought no longer existed in a man. With him, she finds moments of peace. With Elijah, she rediscovers her purpose. And with herself, she begins a journey of rediscovery, forgiveness, and hope. Story time, the promise of us. Grace had never imagined her life would end up like this. Standing at the edge of her front door, one hand clutching her newborn son, the other gripping a worn-out bag with barely anything in it. The early morning air was cold against her cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the icy numbness that had settled inside her. Behind her was the house, where she had once believed in forever. The house where she'd once smiled into the mirror wearing a wedding dress, telling herself, this is what love feels like. She had been wrong. The bruises had faded. The words hadn't. You're nothing without me. Simon's voice still echoed in her ears, but in her arms was a heartbeat, the only reason she had endured, survived, and now fled. Grace didn't have a plan, just a promise. I'll protect you, she whispered into her baby's ear, even if I lose everything. She took one last look at the house, not to remember, but to remind herself of what she would never return to, and then she stepped into the dark morning, into the unknown, into freedom. The city bus was cold and nearly empty. Grace sat near the back, rocking her baby as the engine groaned to life. Every bump in the road was a jolt to her fear. What if Simon followed her? What if she had made a mistake? But then Elijah stirred and cooed softly in her arms. That sound, soft, pure, gave her just enough courage to stay on the bus and not look back. At the station, a kind-eyed woman at the information desk noticed her. First time leaving? Grace nodded, unable to speak. The woman didn't ask for more. She just handed her a map, a local hotline card, and said, "You're braver than you think." Those few words were more support than she'd received in months. Grace found shelter in a small women's home run by a local charity. The rooms were simple but clean, the staff patient and warm. It was there that she met Miriam, a volunteer who never pressed, never judged. Miriam offered hot meals and even warmer words. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said softly. "Only what you're ready to say." Grace nodded. But in the silence between them, she found a kind of comfort she hadn't felt in years. Each night, Elijah slept beside her, and each morning, she woke a little stronger. Her wounds weren't gone, but she was learning that healing didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was as quiet as a breath. Miriam eventually introduced Grace to Daniel, a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery. Daniel didn't wear a tie or sit behind a desk. He sat across from her in a sunlit room and spoke with a voice that didn't demand answers. "What made you leave?" he asked one day. Grace didn't answer for a long time. Then, quietly, she said, "He stopped seeing me. He only saw someone to control. And I forgot who I was." Daniel smiled gently. "But you remembered." That was the beginning of remembering herself, the strong, kind, dreaming girl she had once been. With help from the shelter, Grace found a job at a cafe. The work was simple, cleaning, taking orders, smiling politely. But each paycheck felt like freedom earned. She began saving every dollar she could. Not for escape, this time for stability. A place of her own. A future for Elijah. Some nights were still hard. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer had power over her. Every day she chose to rise, to show up, to keep going. That was her victory. Healing didn't come all at once. Some days, Grace felt like she was standing on solid ground. Other days, memories pulled her under like waves, fierce, unrelenting. There were moments at work when the sound of raised voices froze her in place, or nights when a knock on the shelter's door sent her heart racing. She had learned to mask it with smiles, to nod politely and continue. But inside, she felt the cracks forming again. One evening, while folding Elijah's clothes, she broke down. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she gripped a tiny onesie to her chest. She had left the violence, but she hadn't left the damage. Miriam found her curled up on the floor and simply sat beside her. "You don't need to be strong all the time," she said softly. Grace didn't respond, but she leaned into the quiet presence beside her, grateful for someone who understood the language of silence. Weeks passed, and Grace began to feel a fragile sense of peace. But peace is a delicate thing when you've lived in survival mode for too long. One afternoon, she was walking home from work when she thought she saw Simon across the street. The same stance, the same cold expression. She froze. Her legs refused to move, her breath caught in her throat. She clutched Elijah's stroller so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man turned, and it wasn't him. Relief flooded her, quickly followed by shame. "He's not here. He can't find me." But fear didn't listen to reason. That night, she barely slept. Old nightmares returned, Simon's voice, his anger, the sound of breaking things. But then Elijah stirred beside her, his tiny hand reaching for hers in the dark. "I'm here," she whispered, holding his fingers. "We're safe, and I'll never let him near you." It was the first time she truly believed her own promise. Daniel continued to help her through the healing. One day, he asked her a question that lingered, long after the session ended. "Do you think you'll ever love again?" Grace laughed, bitterly at first. "Love?" she echoed. "That word feels dangerous. Or maybe," Daniel said gently, "it's just waiting for you to redefine it." She didn't answer. But later that night, holding Elijah close, she thought about the love she was building now. Gentle, patient, forgiving. A love that asked nothing but gave everything. Maybe love wasn't something you searched for. Maybe it was something you created, piece by piece. Winter arrived, blanketing the small town in white. Grace found warmth not just in the shelter, but in the friendships she had started to form at the cafe and with other women at the shelter. There was Amaka, who always told jokes that made her laugh until her sides hurt. There was Janelle, who read poetry aloud in the evenings. And there was life, little, beautiful pockets of it, like Elijah's first steps on Christmas morning. Grace cried as he stumbled into her arms, not because of what he did, but because she had made it. He was walking, he was smiling, and they were alive. In the soft light of that quiet morning, she saw the life she was fighting. The new year brought clarity. With help from Miriam and the shelter, Grace found a small studio apartment. It was modest, cracked tiles, old windows, but it was hers. For the first time, she had a key to a door no one else controlled, a space no one could invade. They moved in during a soft rain. Elijah giggled as they lay on the mattress together that first night, surrounded by boxes and possibility. As Grace looked up at the ceiling, she whispered, "We made it." She wasn't healed. She wasn't whole, but she was becoming. And that, she realized, was more than enough. The studio apartment became more than a place to sleep. It became a home. With every photo Grace pinned to the wall and every book she read to Elijah before bed, she was stitching together a new kind of family. Miriam still visited often, bringing warm meals and stories from the shelter. Amaka dropped by with jokes and loud laughter, her presence a burst of color in Grace's quiet world. One evening, they all shared dinner on the floor, laughing over spilled juice and burned rice. "This," Grace whispered later that night, tucking Elijah in, "this is what family feels like. Not blood, not obligation, choice." It was a letter that cracked the calm. A cream-colored envelope arrived at the cafe, addressed in a handwriting Grace would never forget. Simon had found her. The manager handed it to her, smiling. "Looks important." Grace took it with trembling fingers. She didn't open it. She sat with it for days, staring at the corner where her name was scrawled. Her heart raced every time she touched it. But one evening, after putting Elijah to bed, she lit a candle and read it. "I'm sorry," it began. "I miss you. Let me see my son." Her hands clenched. Regret didn't erase scars, and absence didn't rewrite history. She folded the letter, burned it in the candlelight, and whispered, "Not anymore." Despite the letter, Grace didn't spiral. Instead, she grew stronger. She enrolled in night classes, early childhood development, The idea had been a whisper in the back of her mind. But now it became a purpose. She loved children. She understood them. And maybe, just maybe, her pain could serve a purpose greater than her survival. Classes were hard. Balancing work, motherhood, and study left her exhausted, but every A she earned felt like a love letter to the girl she used to be, the one who once dreamed, the one who was still here. One spring afternoon, Grace met him. His name was Malik, a gentle-voiced librarian with a quiet smile and patient eyes. He helped her find books for her coursework, sometimes offered Elijah small toys when they visited. At first, she avoided eye contact. Men still made her nervous, but Malik never pushed. He greeted them with respect, never with expectation, and little by little, her heart began to warm, not with romance, but with the simple idea. Not all men hurt. Some heal. When Malik finally asked her out, for coffee, Grace froze. She liked him. That terrified her. "I don't think I'm ready," she said, eyes cast down. To her surprise, he nodded. "That's okay. I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't just his patience that moved her. It was his willingness to stay without demanding anything. Still, Grace found herself pulling back. She couldn't bear the idea of losing what little peace she had gained. The space between them grew. And so did her questions. Was she capable of loving again? Or had pain built too many walls? One rainy evening, Malik arrived uninvited, only to deliver a children's book. Elijah had left at the library. Grace opened the door slowly, startled. He was soaked, holding the book like it was something precious. "You dropped this," he said, smiling. She invited him in for tea. They sat in the dim kitchen, sipping quietly as Elijah slept. When Malik left, Grace stood at the door watching the rain. For the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt possibility. Therapy had taught Grace that healing required release. One evening, she gathered her old wedding photos, torn journal pages, and a silver bracelet Simon once gave her. She walked to the riverbank, Elijah in a carrier on her back. Piece by piece, she let the past fall into the water. Tears came, not from pain, but from release. "I forgive you," she whispered, not for Simon's sake, but her own. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was power. Grace texted Malik later that night. "Coffee?" They met the next morning under a tree in the park. Elijah chased butterflies nearby, his laughter carrying through the breeze. Malik looked at her carefully. "What changed?" "I did," she said. They talked for hours. No rushing, no confessions, just understanding. When their hands brushed, Grace didn't pull away. A month later, Malik introduced her to his sister. She was warm and kind. But Grace still panicked afterward. What if I'm not enough? What if I can't be what he needs? She almost ended it right there. But then Malik said, "I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real. And you, Grace, you're the realest person I know." And just like that, her doubts quieted. When Malik knelt one afternoon in the library's children's section, Elijah sitting nearby building blocks, Grace didn't cry. She laughed. A deep, joyous laugh. He didn't propose with a ring. He held a paper heart Elijah had made. "Marry me, not just for us, but for the family we're building." Grace took the paper heart, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "Yes." Because love wasn't a promise of perfection. It was a promise to stay. The village road was still the same, dusty, winding, lined with trees that whispered old memories. But for Grace, every step back felt foreign, like walking through a photograph of a life she no longer belonged to. Elijah clung to her hand, his little fingers warm, grounding her to the present. Malik stood waiting at the porch of their newly rented cottage, a place they would call home, not because it was grand, but because it was safe. As Grace approached, her heart pounded. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of beginning again. He met her halfway, arms open. Grace didn't collapse into him. She walked into his embrace on her own terms. "You're home?" he whispered. And for the first time, Grace believed it. They didn't have much. Secondhand furniture, cracked tiles, mismatched plates. But they had peace. They had space to exhale. Elijah had his own bed. Grace had her name on the lease. Malik had his love beside him. No raised voices, no footsteps that made her flinch. Just slow mornings, shared laughter, and the sacred act of healing in silence. That night, lying beside Malik, Grace whispered into the darkness, "I'm scared." Malik's hand found hers under the blanket. "Me too," he said. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." He days blended gently, a rhythm that started with Malik's quiet morning coffee, Elijah's giggles from the bathroom, and Grace, learning to breathe without apology. But healing wasn't linear. One morning, as Grace folded Elijah's clothes, she found his old hospital ID tag, a relic from the day she sat beside his crib, praying he'd live long enough to meet kindness. She collapsed on the floor, holding it to her chest, her sobs muffled against her knees. Malik found her there, knelt down, didn't speak, just held her. Later that evening, Grace asked him, "How do you deal with my broken pieces?" He looked at her, eyes soft but steady. "You're not broken. You're a mosaic, and I'm lucky to love every shard." That night she made dinner, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Every small act, opening a window, calling her mother, watching Elijah sleep without dread, was a quiet triumph. They didn't rush into marriage. They rebuilt. Each week, Malik asked, "Do you still choose me?" And every time Grace answered, "Yes, even more than yesterday." When they stood beneath the garden arch, their second ceremony, there were no guests, just Elijah holding the rings, the wind blessing their vows. Grace took Malik's hand. "I promise to speak. Even when silence feels easier, I promise to listen, even when it's hard. I promise to stay, even when fear begs me to run." Malik's voice shook. "I promise to honor your scars, to never ask you to forget, to walk beside you, never in front of you." They kissed, not with passion, but with peace. It was the little things that haunted her, the creak of a door, the sound of a belt, being unbuckled, the faint smell of whiskey, but Malik never asked her to move on. He simply built a life where those things lost their power. He changed his cologne when he saw her flinch. He made sure their arguments ended with hugs. He learned to sleep lightly, so he could wake if she called out in the night. One afternoon, Elijah brought home a drawing, Grace, Malik, and himself, all holding hands under a rainbow. Grace cried because healing wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the safety she had created around her son. The letter arrived unexpectedly. From Simon, it was handwritten, neat, and far too late. "I've entered counseling. I know that doesn't undo anything, but I wanted you to know I'm trying. I never stopped loving Elijah. I'm sorry for how I showed it." Grace sat with it for hours. She burned it the next morning, not out of hate, but out of finality. Later, she told Malik, "Forgiveness is not reopening a door. It's walking past it without needing to knock." Malik nodded. "And you never have to answer again." That weekend, they planted a cherry blossom tree in the yard, symbol of fleeting pain and lasting beauty. To be continued in part 2, Grace and Malik's journey is far from over. As their love deepens and the past fades into memory, new challenges and greater triumphs await. In part 2 of The Promise of Us, discover how their bond is tested, strengthened, and ultimately transformed by purpose, resilience, and the legacy of healing they build, not just for themselves, but for others still walking through the dark. The story continues in the next part. Want to read more? Grab your copy of The Promise of Us on Amazon now. Click link below. Your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.